today's session, Research 101, Developing a Manifesto for Ethical Community-Based Research in Vancouver's Downtown Eastside. This is hosted by Community-Based Research Canada. My name is Julia Coburn, and I'm the program coordinator for CBRC and the moderator for today's session. Community-Based Research Canada, I'm just going to move this, is mission is to address real societal problems through research as a national champion and facilitator for community-based research and campus community engagement in Canada. For 10 years, CBRC has brought together key players for community campus partnerships. Some CBRC founding members continue to be on the CBRC board today. Our network builds capacity for academia and broader communities to collaborate and use research as a tool to mobilize community participation and action. So we'd love to continue to hear from you throughout this webinar. You can please share your comments and questions in the chat box you can see on the lower right side during the presentation. I will share your questions to the presenters during the Q&A period, which will take place for the last 15 minutes of the webinar. So I'm pleased to introduce our today's presenters, Jewel Chapman, Scott Neufeld, and Jim McLeod. Jewel Chapman has been involved with research in the Downtown Eastside for many years, both as a long-term research participant in drug use-related research, and more recently as a peer research assistant at the BC Centre on Substance Abuse. She identifies as a long-time drug user, but most importantly, she identifies as a survivor of childhood trauma. She volunteers in the board of Sex Workers United Against Violence, works as a peer support outreach worker, is an avid writer and poet with many pieces published in Vancouver's Megaphone magazine, and has a co-authored academic publication in AIDS and behavior. And I'm moving from left to right. Scott Neufeld is a white settler who grew up on the unceded territory of the Kwantlen people, Langley, BC, and now lives and works in East Vancouver on the unceded territories of Musqueam, you may have to kind of correct me, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. He has an MA in social psychology from Simon Fraser University and is currently completing a PhD in social psychology at SFU and the BC Centre on Substance Use, with a focus on representations of people who use drugs in anti-stigma campaigns. Other interests include community-based research, social identity theory, collective resistance, NIMBYism, and decolonization. And last but not least, we have Jim McLeod, who believes the Downtown Eastside is brimming with talent the rest of the world overlooks. A self-described functional addict, chemically dependent since elementary school, people are often surprised to learn that Jim has a spotless criminal record. He is an active community member working with Hives for Humanity and has served on the boards for the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users and the Drug Users Resource Center. He is excited about his work with Megaphone Magazine's Speakers Bureau project, working with audiences and participants to help them see people who use drugs as just that, people. So thank you so much, and I'm going to let the presenters take it over from here.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having us, everybody, and thank you for that introduction, Julia. My name is Scott, this is Jim, and this is Jewel. And just to kind of give a brief outline, we're going to do our own territory acknowledgement here in a minute. We'll give a bit of background on the Downtown Eastside neighborhood. We'll talk a bit about some of the pitfalls and the potential of research in the neighborhood, and also just the amount of research that happens here. And then we'll introduce what Research 101 was as kind of a bit of a response to some of the issues around research in the neighborhood. And then we'll talk about what's in this thing called the Manifesto for Ethical Research in the Downtown Eastside. I give a summary of this document that we produced out of these workshops called Research 101. And we'll talk about some of the next steps that we've been working on before we jump into the questions. But as Julia mentioned, if just looking at the little questions coming in, I'll try not to do that because I think Julia is handling that. But if there are questions throughout, feel free to just write them in you can type them, I think, and then we'll come back to them at the end. Okay.
Yeah, we're here on the unceded, ancestral, and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. through the First Nations who are also been resisting a lot of bad research practices for a long time and are heavily researched, much like the Downtown Eastside.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, we always just recognize that that's sort of the context that we see our work in as a part of this long history of resisting colonial or extractive research practices. And Jewel was going to read a poem for us.
Yes. We need to tell our own stories. If we don't tell our stories, people with power will tell our stories for us. And we don't like what they say. When we tell our stories, we reach out to each other and build community. We share our pain, we share our hope, we share our laughter. And our determination when we'll tell our stories. We draw our own maps and we question the maps of the powerful. Each of us has something to tell, something to teach. We speak the language of the heart here in the Downtown Eastside, the soul of Vancouver.
Thanks, Jewel.
Thank you.
And that Jewel is also a poet, but that was a poem written by somebody else, a fellow named Sandy Cameron, who was a long-term resident and poet in the Downtown Eastside neighborhood. Speaking of the Downtown Eastside, we recognize we're talking to an audience across Canada, so people may have different levels of familiarity with the neighborhood, but really it's a very small corner of the wider Vancouver, city of Vancouver. You can see it in the map here, and here's sort of a little bit more of a close-up, and we're actually curious if people who are listening in across Canada, so that's you, the audience, that we can't actually see right now. But if people want to, a couple of people wanted to just maybe type in, I know you can type in the chat thing, what are a couple of things that maybe you feel like you know about the Downtown Eastside neighborhood? If a couple of people want to just write in, we thought that would be interesting, because we know it's a neighborhood that maybe it's often in the news, for better or worse, and maybe people feel like they know something about this Downtown Eastside neighborhood.
Have they ever been to the Downtown Eastside?
Yeah. We'll give a couple minutes for that. Maybe nobody wants to respond, but we'll give you the chance. Okay, somebody says they worked there for a long time and there's a lot going on. People say they usually hear about it in a negative fashion. People would like to know more about the population that actually lives in the Downtown Eastside. So somebody is recognizing that there is an InSite, the supervised consumption site or safe injection site that's in the Downtown Eastside. That was the first one of those in North America. Somebody says there's a lot of social services there. Somebody's got a history working with youth who lived in the Downtown Eastside. So it sounds like there's sort of a variety of experiences. Somebody is saying, that they're joining from outside of Canada. That's great. Nice. So they maybe know even less about Vancouver or the Downtown Eastside. We'll fill in the gaps a bit. And actually wondered if maybe Jewel and Jim wanted to give a little bit of just a few words about maybe some of your experiences living in this neighborhood.
I often say that Vancouver has a lot of neighborhoods, but there's no actual community left. It's looking like community, actually everyone here actually looks out for each other, and it's a lot more close-knit than any other neighborhood in Vancouver. That's one reason that despite having being the epicenter of the overdose crisis, for the number of overdose deaths, you have the fewest deaths for the lowest ratio of deaths, because everyone down here carries Narcan and don't look out for each other. And there's a lot of it's a very accepting neighborhood. A lot of people come here because it's the one place where they feel they belong and are accepted no matter what. It's very big capacity and very resilient. It's gone through a lot, and people still just keep on fighting, keep on going, pushing on. So it's I've been part of this neighborhood for about 10 years now, and pretty committed to it, because I didn't really realize as much about it until this last time I came here, and it's got a lot of very strong capacity people, and it's that actual community where everyone actually belongs.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful because a lot of times we get bad publicity about the Downtown Eastside, and they just focus on the negative. But to me, that's more of a motivation to be motivated to try to be part of the opposite, to be part of the good side. Like Speakers Bureau, Research 101, there's many different projects, and we wear many different hats in the community. So we're a part of a lot of different things and entities here. And I think it's really powerful to see that people that normally get stigmatized or put down can actually be very powerful when they get together and form a group. And Research 101 is like a good example of how it can just sort of spread. And it's amazing to see how positive and how great, even though we have like a bad sort of reputation as a role, it's starting to sort of turn it around a bit and realize like we're all people, and we're all, we all want to fight hard for our communities, and regardless of where we live, it's still our community nonetheless. And it's very powerful.
Yeah.
It's actually a lot of the reason that it's like you have the research down here is probably because of the there's a lot of like open drug use and poverty and a lot of social issues, but it's also heavily researched because we're actually like the home of a lot of novel ideas for dealing with those issues, like the Inside Safe Injection site and the overdose prevention sites actually started. There's a pop-up tent in an alley where you're sick of seeing people dying of overdoses, so people start setting up tents in the alley and stuff like that. There's a lot of innovative ideas. Like the government just follows in safe district behind us, and after getting a shit for a while, they eventually realized that it worked and started doing it themselves. So,
yeah, thanks both of you. I think those are both just really important points that aren't always captured in the way that media or people who don't live in the neighborhood tell the story of the Downtown Eastside. And so one important piece of the context here is the amount of research that happens in the Downtown Eastside, and this is what Jim was touching on. So people sometimes describe it as a heavily researched neighborhood. Sometimes people say it's one of the most researched communities in the world, based on how small it is and how much research happens. So there was a review, it actually wasn't even a really very thorough review that was done in 2012. And they found about 100 reviewed articles, peer-reviewed articles, dissertations, research reports that have been published over the past 10 years, 2001 to 2011. That's specifically on the Downtown Eastside neighborhood. And then there was a much more thorough review that was done by one of our colleagues, Alina McKay, who was working here. That was in 2017. And she found more than 700 published research articles, and the majority of those had actually been done since that previous review, since 2010. As one example, just in 2016 alone, there was about 60 research articles that had been published just on this small Downtown Eastside neighborhood. And another thing worth pointing out is that about 2/3 of those are behind paywalls, so they're not open access articles. They're inaccessible to the majority of the people living in the neighborhood who aren't connected to an academic institution, who don't have subscriptions to academic journals. So a lot of research and a lot of it inaccessible. And I think these questions about representing the Downtown Eastside are really important. This photo here, it's maybe a bit shocking. This is maybe the way that a lot of people think of the Downtown Eastside neighborhood. And I choose this photo to show, not because I think it's the most representative, but because Google maybe thinks it is. If you type Downtown Eastside into Google Images search, that's the first image that comes up. And I think that does represent the way that many people perhaps imagine this neighborhood. But as with any community or neighborhood, a group of people, there are many different ways of telling the story of the Downtown Eastside. This is another example that really could go both ways. People could say there's a lot of homelessness in the neighborhood. This is a tent city homeless encampment that was in Oppenheimer Park from a couple of years ago. There's actually another one in the park currently that's been there for a couple of months. On the one hand, it's an example of how much homelessness and housing insecurity there is in the neighborhood. On the other hand, it's also an example of the organization of a community, of people banding together and saying it's actually safer if we put our tents up next to each other, if we can try and protect ourselves a little bit, form some community, even though we're living outside. And as Jim was mentioning, there's a really strong history of community organization and activism in the neighborhood. People banding together, rising up and saying we need to fight for our rights, fight for equality, whether that be arguing for more housing or better housing policy, fighting against gentrification, somebody mentioned gentrification, or as Jim was also mentioning, in the area of harm reduction and substance use. People responding over decades now out of just being in a place of being people who use drugs, a community that's experiences a lot of harm, mostly from the criminalization of drugs, overdoses, various infectious diseases, etc. But people banding together and saying it doesn't have to be like this. There are things that we can do as a community to keep ourselves safe, to reduce the harm that we experience, whether that's safe injection sites or needle exchanges, or a crosstown clinic is a really interesting example. It's a heroin-assisted therapy, so a small group of people in the neighborhood go to this clinic and receive a medical-grade pharmaceutical dose of heroin several times a day as a way of sort of an early version of what many people are now calling safe supply. Pigeon Park Savings is another example of an innovative kind of approach to just banking for people in the neighborhood that was developed in the neighborhood. This is just even another facet of the neighborhood. It's not only drugs and poverty. There's lots of garden, really cool stuff that's happening here that's really could happen in any neighborhood, or perhaps is happening even more in this neighborhood. There's our friend Jim here is in one of these photos. He's a beekeeper with Hives for Humanity, is a local organization that runs a lot of gardens, does a lot of urban farming, and raises bees in the neighborhood. So there's lots of different things going on in the Downtown Eastside. And so where does research fit into all of this? The way we, I think, often think about research is that, of course, it's got this academic side, it's about knowledge production, but it's also about storytelling. Research is a really powerful way of telling a story of a group of people or a community or a neighborhood. It's a particular lens on storytelling. And of course, research can be helpful. Nobody, I think, in this Research 101 group would say research is completely useless. We should never do research. A couple of examples. People do get paid for participating in research, especially also for helping to run and design and carry out the data collection for research. That's really common in this neighborhood. When it's done well, research can be something that's educational, that feels empowering when it really does include the community. And also provide evidence for harm reduction, for services in the neighborhood that were sort of pioneered by the community, and building up the evidence that they're effective is an important way of keeping them open, both inside and crosstown. These two innovative, harm reduction spaces that were developed uniquely in the Downtown Eastside were really kept alive by research that supported that they really, really worked, that they saved lives, that they had all kinds of positive benefits. But of course, research can also hurt. There's lots of harms that are associated with research. Here's a couple examples. We sometimes call it the triple X. So first of all, there's exploitation. Research can sometimes take more than it gives. There's extraction. Research can maybe take more or something that it shouldn't. And this one is maybe a little bit less often recognized, but there's exhaustion. When there's so much research in a particular community, people can become fatigued by research. Not only just that there's so much and we're tired of being researched, but also just that, especially when it does involve people from the community, that maybe some of the best, most powerful advocates for the community are suddenly maybe tied up in a research project. And is that actually the best use of their time and energy compared to other things that they could be doing to support their community? A couple of other possible harms from research. These are all things that people discussed when we were having these Research 101 discussions, was that researchers can promise a false hope. They can say, our research is going to lead to these positive changes in your community, and it's just often not that simple. There's a long process between research and actual change, but sometimes researchers can sort of suggest it's a simple and quick process. Research can be irrelevant. Sometimes people do research and the people in the community says, you know, who doesn't know this? And why do you need to know? Research can be something that people do instead of taking action. So sometimes people say, we don't need more research on this. We know what the problem is. We know what we need to do. All that's lacking is the political will. And then finally, research can also perpetuate stigma about a place. This is one example that we sometimes use. So this is a study that was published a couple of years ago about the Downtown Eastside. They didn't actually talk to any participants in the neighborhood. They were just linking administrative records and kind of pinpointing individuals living in the Downtown Eastside neighborhood who were using a variety of different services involved with the justice system, involved with the health system. And the researchers wanted to use this, you know, look at the data to make an argument about some of the insufficiencies in the current social system that we have, saying there's a revolving door, this is not effective, it's wasting money, we need to change the system. Other people interpreted it in a slightly different way. This is local media in Vancouver saying SFU study suggests 300 offenders on Downtown Eastside cost $26.5 million in services. And of course, then other people pick up that story and use it in different ways. So this is a columnist in the same, another local paper talking about this research study and using it to talk about the high cost of misery in Vancouver's Downtown Eastside. And this column is really an argument in support of the gentrification and displacement of the folks who do live in the Downtown Eastside, a traditionally low-income community, essentially arguing that, you know, the neighborhood should be bulldozed into the ocean, that it should no longer exist as a community. If people are not familiar with the work of Eve Tuck, she's an Indigenous education scholar. I think she's at the University of Toronto right now, but I'd highly, highly recommend all of her work, especially this 2009 paper called Suspending Damage, A Letter to Communities. And she argues that for urban communities, for Indigenous communities, often research has entirely focused on what is wrong in these communities. What is the damage that's been wrought by oppression, by colonization, and just by kind of focusing on those damages, the theory of change that's worked there is that if we can only demonstrate how bad things are, then somehow we'll be able to argue for change. And she argues that that actually has a really significant cost for the communities themselves, to only be represented as damaged, to only be represented as broken. And as both Jewel and Jim were mentioning before, there are so many other beautiful, strength-based ways of talking about this Downtown Eastside neighborhood, not only the damage, not only the harm. So that's a bit of the background to the Downtown Eastside and research in this neighborhood. And so we sometimes talk about it as maybe, is it that there's unethical research? Is it that there's disrespectful research? But ultimately, there is a problem around research. Many people do not have positive experiences of research in the neighborhood, and that's been going on for a very long time. So Research 101 is something that we developed over a long period through a whole bunch of conversations with different folks in the neighborhood. And it culminated kind of in a series of workshops that we did back in the spring of 2018. Feels like a long time ago now. And there were sort of two main goals. First of all was through a series of critical conversations around research in the neighborhood to just clarify what expectations were within the community, within people that were dealing with researchers, that were participating in research, around what does respectful, useful, ethical research look like to them in the Downtown Eastside, and then also to try and reduce some of the harms associated with research by empowering communities to say no or to demand more from researchers. It was initially a partnership between two or three organizations. So this is Johal from SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement, very generously partnered with us at a really early stage and made some money available that was able to support the initial workshops and some of the kind of knowledge translation that came out of it. Then in the bottom here, we've got Sarah Common. She is one of the directors of Hives for Humanity, the organization Jim works with, and she was really a key supporter, giving us space and just providing a lot of the kind of in-community logistics and things that made Research 101 happen. So those are some of the supporters. SFPIRG is an organization at SFU that helped with some of the planning and logistics as well. And then in terms of who were we actually talking to and who was involved, there are so many different amazing organizations in the Downtown Eastside. I won't go through them all, but these are a list of some of the organizations that we connected with to see if they were interested in participating in Research 101. So some of them represent people who use drugs. So the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users is one that we mentioned before, and there was a lot of good support from that organization. Some of these organizations work with Indigenous folks in the neighborhood, so Culture Saves Lives, or WARS, the Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction Society. Some of these organizations work with sex workers, so Sex Workers United Against Violence, organization Jewel is involved with. PACE is another one. And then some are just sort of more general community organizations. In the bottom right, we've got the Carnegie Community Center. They have a bunch of different groups that work with researchers in the neighborhood. So those are a couple of the organizations. Somewhere between 6 and 13 folks that would come out to each week, some of them more consistent than others, but basically from a whole host of different organizations that regularly work with researchers in the neighborhood. And so really it was mostly people with lived experience of substance use, sex work, criminalization, being over-researched, etc. I mentioned there were 6 workshops. So the first week, it was just kind of a general intro to research in the Downtown Eastside, people sharing some of their experiences. We talked about the pitfalls, the potential of research. In the second week, we talked about some of the early stages of a research project, especially around, what are some of the things that folks in the community want to know, want to ask researchers as they're starting a research project. The third week, we talked about ethics. So we talked about research ethics boards at universities and how sometimes the way that REBs think about ethics in community-based research especially aren't always exactly the same as the way that community members might think about what's ethical or respectful when it comes to research in their community. In the fourth week, we talked about the actual experience of participating and collaborating on research. We talked about especially issues around power and peer researchers. Then in the fifth week, we talked about one of my favorite words, reciprocity. Some people in the Research 101 like to joke with me that they didn't think that was a real word until they heard me say that. But we talked about this idea of what are the benefits that come from research and how can those become a little bit more equal between the researchers who get benefits such as grants and degrees and jobs versus the community who sometimes the benefits of research are a little bit less clear. We talked about some of those maybe later stages of a research project. In the sixth week, we came back and we'd summarized a sort of rough draft we'd had in the first 5 weeks, and we had agreed together at the beginning we wanted to write a summary of this series of workshops. We wanted to call it a manifesto for ethical research. And so in this final week, we all sat together around these tables and we all looked at this draft of this manifesto. We went line by line and really kind of edited it together. We made sure everybody agreed with what was in there, that this was a good representation of the discussions that we'd had. And we decided everyone who had participated in one of the workshops, at least one, and who agreed to have their name on it could be listed as a co-author, and that we would order these alphabetically. So it wasn't about who had done the most or who had contributed the majority. We really wanted this to be something everyone, their expertise, their experience that they had shared was being equally recognized within this manifesto. The very first version of it, which still exists, is an online Google Doc version of the manifesto. You can access that through this shortened link at the top there. And that's handy because we can continue to update the manifesto. It is a living document. We're probably going to come up with a new, slightly updated version in the next couple of months, just as we've learned more and had more conversations with different people about this work. So that's still available. But in the spring, we were really fortunate. We had some people support us with developing and sort of redesigning a hard copy version of the manifesto, like this one here. And that's been really, really cool because it enables us to just share it in the community. It's kind of fun to give people a booklet version of this online doc thing. Anyway, so that's just, it's the same content, just slightly moved around and with cool pictures and things like that. There's also, do you want to mention about the card?
Yeah, it's also, it's color coded up and everything to match up with a sister card kind of. We released the Empowering Informed Consent, which is a little bit more broadly spread. It's not just for research, but also for just community, for social productions, like people that are doing documentaries or people coming around doing artwork or just any other people who's coming into the neighborhood wanting to interact with us, but which may be doing it in negative ways. Like we've a lot of us have had negative experiences with people doing like coming in and doing documentaries and deciding to tell their story using us instead of telling our story and just doing things like that. So we put together the Empowering Informed Consent card and just kind of let people know what part of some of the things aren't really rights you have, but you always have a right to say no and a right to ask them what they actually are going to do with it and everything. So you want to give people a bit of a chance to actually know what they're getting into and how to avoid those bad situations.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Jim. So there was Research 101 led to the manifesto, but it was part of a wider project about community ethics in cultural production. And this card that Jim was holding up, the Empowering Informed Consent card, is sort of the other product that we came up with out of this wider project. And we'll try and provide a link to an online version of that after the webinar. But it's really cool. It's a just pocket-sized thing that could fit in your wallet. It folds up kind of accordion style, and so potentially somebody could just have it on them, let's say a researcher or an artist or photographer, reporter, just literally talks to them on the street and says, hey, can I tell your story? Can I take your photo? Can I represent that somewhere else? It's just a bunch of critical questions that somebody could ask the reporter or whoever it is that wants to tell their story and say, how are you going to protect my rights as an individual to have some control over my story? Anyway, so there's two materials. We'll just kind of go through quickly what's inside the manifesto. There's sort of these 4 sections based on some of the weeks that I just mentioned. So the first section is kind of about just this getting to know each other stage of research. There's a section on ethical review. There's a section on actually doing the research and some of those issues around power and peer collaboration that I mentioned. And then there's a final section on bringing the research back. So in this first part, I was actually wondering maybe if you guys think, what are some of the things that are important to you if you're starting, if you're thinking about should we work with a researcher or anyone who wants to tell the story of me or my community? What are some of the things that jump out to you as, these are important things to find out?
Who they represent and what their agenda may be. Just to sort of get it up on the table, like what their main goal is or what they want to portray of the project.
Yeah, I think if they have past experiences with the thing, like if it's someone who is lost somebody to an overdose and is become very closed-minded and just basically wants to do things just to shut down drug use or something like that, or if they just want to negatively portray something because they've had a bad experience in the past with poor people or with poverty themselves or with drug use or something like that, if they just already have a bias towards it or just basically want to try to prove their negative side of it through it, then they don't want to deal with them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the other participants in Research 101, I think, echoed some of those things. They're just recognizing right away that researchers are people. They're not somehow objective, disconnected individuals with no agenda or preconceptions. And it matters who researchers are, what some of the biases or politics that they're bringing with them, and that needs to be a conversation at an early stage of determining whether or not our community or us as individuals want to give our consent to work with you as a researcher. A couple of other things I'll just touch on. I think a lot of people really felt research needed to be connected to action. Sort of disconnected, purely intellectual research isn't something many people value when they recognize how costly research can be in their community, how much time it takes. So just, making sure up front that's really clear. What actions are you prepared to take on the basis of your research? And also just a lot of those planning things. When are you going to come back and share what you found from the research? How are we going to be involved? How are you anticipating the potential harm that might come from your research? People think a lot about trauma-informed researchers. And how are you going to protect people in the process of doing your research? One idea I always think is kind of interesting is kind of a researcher reference letter. If somebody is maybe collaborated with other communities in the past, it maybe isn't that hard to go talk to those communities and say, what was your experience like working with this researcher? Maybe we can anticipate something similar if we're going to work with them. If a researcher has a long trail of broken, burning bridges behind them, maybe that's not somebody we want to work with.
Also, too, I think it's important that that how you word something or how you're trying to get your message across, that they word it and they say it in context to how you're meaning it.
Yeah, so even just providing those opportunities to check back of, what is your analysis or interpretation of our words, our stories, our data? Did you get it right, or are you misunderstanding and misrepresenting our community? The second section is a bit more about ethical review. It talks a bit about some of the limitations of university REBs, especially when it comes to looking at community-based research. Sometimes there are just different understandings of what risk means in a community, depending on where you're situated, different understandings of harm or benefits. And another disadvantage of REBs is that, and this isn't necessarily their fault, but they don't have an accountability mechanism. They're not set up oftentimes to police researchers, to check on compliance. And so that's sometimes where some of those gray things happen. Because I think there is this just reality that all the research that happens in this neighborhood has been approved by REBs at universities. Nevertheless, many people have an experience of research that it's disrespectful, that it's disconnected, that it's perhaps even unethical. And so there is this disconnect that needs to be explained. And I think these are some of the ways of looking at it. Another issue is just this focus on individuals, perhaps rather than looking more at a community or group level. So perhaps that study that we mentioned before is a good example. No individual, where they were linking the administrative records, no individuals were even contacted for the research. Nevertheless, the findings of the research have huge implications for what is said, what can be argued about the neighborhood as a whole. So a couple of recommendations that came out of Research 101 was, first of all, just make your ethics application a conversation with the community organization. Hopefully, ideally, you've actually developed it together, that collaboration in the community has started at a really early stage before you've submitted the ethics application. If it hasn't, at least sit down and say, here is what we're saying in this ethics application, and let's figure this out. Maybe we can reach a research agreement or develop some kind of community-based accountability mechanism that can make sure that we are thinking about research ethics throughout the process of this project. The final idea is sort of a big can of worms that we won't fully open here, but there was a lot of interest and energy folks had around developing some version of a community-based research ethics board or research review body in the Downtown Eastside, so that community members themselves could be in a position where they can be looking at researchers' proposals at an early stage and giving their feedback on maybe here are some of the things you're missing, or here are some of the, some of the ways that maybe you should adjust what you're planning so that it could better meet the expectations the community has around keeping the community safe and respecting and protecting us. That's something we continue to do a lot of work on. Power and peers. I think, I know, Julie, you've had a lot of experience doing peer research, so being employed for your lived experience and different things that researchers are interested in, and doing data collection, etc. I don't know if you have any quick examples of ways that sometimes goes well or doesn't go as well. Sorry to put you on the spot.
The hotel study. It's actually an ongoing study that I've been part of for over 7 years as a participant, and it's very positive in the sense that it helps sort of put into perspective how people's lifestyle choices in the Downtown Eastside and how everyday, how you live every day, it can either be a positive thing or a negative thing, and they focus more on trying to bring out the positive side of your lifestyle choices, and instead of like concentrating on just the negative. So it is very empowering, and it's very helpful for people to sort of help their community members as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A couple of just quick examples that people sometimes give around ways that peer work can maybe feel a little bit tokenizing or even patronizing is, I think, just recognizing it's really easy for academics to communicate a kind of elitism, or that they don't value the experience or expertise of peers very much, that they give them maybe grunt work, or they only are using them for their access to their social networks. Or just asking to do data entry or something, rather than helping to guide the actual research or to really deploy their expertise and experience as community members to assist with analysis or even setting the research questions. So that those things are really important to navigate, and they can easily be missed by researchers. And I think this sense of entitlement is something that many people react strongly against, this idea that researchers perhaps come to a community with the assumption that their research is really a great gift to the community and it's going to help them, and why don't you just sort of bow down before me. But this is a quote from the manifesto, so just saying, research has been costly for our community. Very rarely has it actually benefited us. Don't assume your research is helpful, wanted, needed, or going to be beneficial for our community. We don't owe you anything. I think that's a really powerful way of putting it. And then just this last point is something that everybody really feels quite strongly about. It's just that it's really important to pay folks fairly for their time in cash, not gift cards. Somebody said, we don't ask what you do with your money. Don't worry what we do with ours. You want to say something? Yeah. This is sort of the last section about community feedback and reciprocity. At a very minimum, people really expect that researchers will come back and tell the community what they found from the research. That was just like an absolute bare minimum, and people had many stories of that not happening and that feeling incredibly disrespectful, even like heartbreaking, people said. And then even still, with that sort of as a minimum expectation that researchers would return and really meaningfully communicate what they found, also the expectation is that researchers themselves and not the community would be the ones responsible for making that happen. So in terms of planning, funding, organizing a meaningful feedback presentation or something, people had examples where that had really just fallen onto the community to organize, to pay for, to order food, and that's just really not appropriate in the context of this community. Second point is just a little bit of a wider context, recognizing that just doing that, just saying what you found, isn't the same thing as reciprocity. That's not even really approaching equalizing the benefits of the research between the researchers and the community. So people, lots of ideas of what maybe could move towards reciprocity. So first of all, going back to that action orientation, really expecting that researchers would prioritize what is most useful and interesting to the community first, before you go off and write some theoretical academic paper, to sit down and write a community-facing report that's really just, what is useful and beneficial about this research for the community. And to do that first, I think is really important. And also finding ways of involving the community throughout that knowledge translation process, inviting and empowering and assisting folks to co-present at conferences, to co-write community reports and academic papers together, writing actual plain language summaries of the work, and even just coming up with other ideas of contributing back to the community beyond research, beyond writing. Maybe it's just coming back, you're a researcher, but you benefited so much from the research you did in this community. Maybe just show up and volunteer. Maybe just find a way to give a financial donation to the organization that you were working with. Organize a positive event in the community. Find ways of giving back that respect and recognize how much you've received from a community. Just to finish up quickly here, so we do have a little bit more time for questions. Some of the next steps, we continue to build support for the manifesto in the community. This is what we call endorsement. So we've got an online form you can access there with that shortened link, R101 support, where it's just where individuals from the neighborhood, from around the world, and also organizations have said, you know what, we are really in support of this manifesto. We want to put our name behind it. And that's just a way for us to indicate that there is a lot of support for this work, recognizing it was a small group of people that initially had the conversations and the workshops and put it together, recognizing that it doesn't necessarily represent the entire community in the way that it started, but as we gain more endorsements from especially local organizations and individuals, we can gradually make a stronger claim that it does represent the interests and experiences of more than just who initially wrote it. I mentioned these handy hard copies of the manifesto that we have, and we've done a lot of work to really share this work around the neighborhood and also beyond. So we've gone to universities, we give guest lectures and graduate research methods classes. Jim and I did one at SFU just a couple months ago. Me, Jewel, and Jim did one at the BC Center on Substance Use back in the spring. So that's something that we continue to do, and that's a really important part of the work for us, is just sharing what we've heard and continuing to make this a conversation for researchers and community organizations alike. I mentioned before this community-based ethics board, or what we've more recently termed it, a community research ethics workshop. We continue to sort of figure out and look at best practices or existing examples of similar things in other heavily researched communities of how can we get community members into a position like an ethics reviewer on an REB, where they're looking at a research proposal at an early stage and providing that community experience and knowledge as part of their feedback and their review, and thinking about the ethics of a project. So that's something that we continue to work on. We could probably do a whole presentation about what we've found and learned on that so far, but that's not what this is about today. And then just this final thing, something that we think, especially talking to this Canadian audience, is really cool and interesting potential, is this idea of potentially replicating the process that we undertook with Research 101 in another place. So we published an article in the spring in Harm Reduction Journal that talks a bit more in detail about what our process was and gives some recommendations for how you could potentially do your own Research 101 in wherever you are. If that's a heavily researched community that maybe faces some of the same issues as the Downtown Eastside. There's actually somebody in Edmonton who recently told us they're gonna try and do this, do their own version of Research 101 in Edmonton, which is really, really cool. We're excited about that. Very quickly, the steps at a high level that would be involved is, first of all, just getting organized, forming the partnerships, engaging the community, figuring out who needs to be in the room, who's most affected by research, harmful research in neighborhood, and starting that conversation, building those relationships. Second, getting those folks together in a way that people can share their stories, share the resources, share the ways that they've already responded to this issue, and sort of dream big about what would a more collective, organized response to this issue be. And third, I think it's just really useful to find a way of summarizing or writing down what came out of that process, like we did with the manifesto, being able to share something. This is the record of what this conversation was. I think it's just really, really handy. And trying your best to make that a really representative process. Make sure everyone is being acknowledged and listed as a co-author. And then finally, doing the work that we really continue to do. This is one example of just sharing that as much as you can in whatever format you can. All right, that's all for us right now. Thank you so much. There's a couple different ways you can follow up. There's so many people that have supported this work financially and just through in-kind support. Can't list them all right here, but those are a few. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much for this wonderful webinar, Jules, Scott, and Jim. It was incredibly informative, and there's been a fantastic dialogue happening as the webinar is happening. So much interest, and I'm glad that you shared how other people can use the research manifesto work in their own context. So there was a lot of questions about that. So I'm going to take up, I think we have just a couple minutes for questions. And Scott, we had a conversation earlier. If people have further questions, they're able to contact you, and it's on the bottom right-hand side of this slide. So thank you for that. One question was from Sonoma, and she was asking about how the research manifesto is impacting community members, and has it been giving them a tool to help kind of are there some recent examples of how it's been used as a tool to help empower community members so far?
It's already become required reading in a couple of university courses that universities here. So I know in that way helping out already, but I can't really think of anything that's actually personally
I think for me personally, I think it's helped people who maybe been part of research previously and had bad experiences, that realizing that it's not all bad and that there is positive projects, and they may tend to get more involved in that sense because they realize that not everybody's been represented and that this is a good thing. So maybe giving them a second chance at trying to be part of it instead of ignoring it.
One example that I think of is something that we've heard from a number of organizations in the Downtown Eastside. And that's often the way that researchers will sort of enter a community, right? They don't necessarily just show up and stand on the street corner and get people to fill out the questionnaires. They'll connect with an organization like the Area Network of Drug Users, and you can talk to the board and explain the project and get consent that way. So at that level, several organizations have said it's really useful for them to be able to give this resource that's been created in the community back to the researchers. Give this a read. Here's an example of some of our expectations around what ethical, respectful research looks like in our community. How are you going to meet these? I know that Sarah doesn't have humanity. I've also heard, people that they're just fatigued with the level of requests that they get at least one a week from new researchers saying, "Can you connect me to this kind of people?" And having this resource is to be able to send back and say, "Check this out." Sometimes it means they don't hear from the researcher again, and they actually feel like that's a good thing. If looking at these expectations is too overwhelming, and there's researchers say, "Well, I don't want to meet those guidelines," then people don't want to work with them.
Yeah, there's so many more questions. I'm going to bring up just one more, and then I encourage you to continue this conversation. I know that one person brought up there was a link that they weren't able to access, and we'll make sure to send that out to everybody later. One question from Charles early on was to ask what outlets would the Downtown Eastside storytellers use for a wider readership or listenership? So how do your voices get out there more, and what are some ways that you're doing currently, or maybe you would like to do in the future?
Megaphone magazine is one. Megaphone magazine is a lot of the articles are great like from community. There's they have some of their own writers, but a lot of the articles are community members. It's called magazine. So yeah, the stuff in the back. Yeah, yeah, and so I've started a play called Olympics. We've done several versions of that. We'll be talking about the oil crisis and about the first responders. With hard impact on the neighborhoods, also not just on the people dying, but also on the people that are working as well. Because you get to know these people and having to get over time, losing a lot of friends and stuff, and getting closer to people and having people run over. It's very they still want to try. There's a lot of support for nurses and first responders, but the real first responders are here. The guys on the paramedics stuff there's always and they're back so it's there's a lot of support for the paramedics and nurses and doctors, but there's no support for the teams down here. They're actually taking the matter. So we'll listen to the good about that. Other programming and voices?
Writing is a huge one. Through Megaphone, I've published quite a few articles, like poems and I think a lot of the time I express myself better in writing than I do in words. So, it's a really wide audience that it goes out to. So I think that it can help sort of make people more aware and realize, again, it's not necessarily a negative thing, that it can be a positive thing. And word is definitely easier to get out sometimes than actual talking to people. So I think that's a huge link that it helps a lot.
Thank you so much for sharing this whole presentation and your work about the Research Manifesto. And we just so appreciate learning about your work and how it could be helping the Downtown Eastside community, but also for other communities across Canada and even internationally. We have people from other countries around the world participating today. Just to let everybody know, there's going to be a recording of this webinar up on the CBRC website that you can go back to at a later date. We'll put that up by next week. And there's many other ways to get involved with the CBRC. You can become a CBRC member as an institution, organization, individual, or student. You can continue to join other webinars like this, and we host them on a regular basis. Please continue to send news and events from your organization, because we'd love to share them with this community. And sign up to our CBRC mailing list by going to the newsletter page and entering your email address. Lastly, we have our biannual CTO Expo coming up in May 2020. So we'd love to see all of you there, as well as please consider presenting at the event. Actually, this could be a fascinating topic for that. It's the presentation proposals are due by December 15th. And
where is that located?
So the link is, so you can go to communityresearchcanada.ca and it'll be under conference or CTU Expo.
Where physically will the conference be?
Where is the conference?
Oh, the conference is in Sault Ste. Marie. That's a great question. So yeah, and we have a short feedback survey that we'd love to hear from you if you have any feedback about this presentation and our webinars. So again, thank you so much. On behalf of Community-Based Research Canada, we'd like to thank our wonderful presenters, Jewel, Scott, and Jim for today's session, and for all of you for joining us. Stay tuned for upcoming webinars, events, and programs from CBRC by going to communityresearchcanada.ca and by signing up for our CBRC mailing list. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks.